So we're going to start a conversation about identity as a source of conflict, and focusing on this idea of nationalism or ethnic conflict, and trying to understand both the prevalence of this kind of conflict as well as sort of what we mean when we talk about ethnic conflict or national conflict. And so to start that off, we'll begin with a definition of ethnicity as social scientists use it, or nationalism as social scientists use it. I should flag again, there's sort of this distinction between the colloquial everyday language way that we make our definitions of sort of how things get used in practice versus how social scientists have sort of like tried to refine and pin down what things actually mean. And so when you hear people talk about nationalism, you'll oftentimes hear that conflated with sort of militarism, and they can overlap, and certainly nationalism can feed into militarism, as we'll talk about in I think 2 weeks or so. But for this point, we're just more talking about groups and how groups conceptualize themselves and their place in the world. And so when we're talking about ethnic groups, we're talking about a community of people that have some sort of common cultural or linguistic or maybe imagined, I'm calling it demographic, but sort of some imagined ancestry where there's sort of this, sense of like we all come from the same group or community. But it's not just that sort of outsiders can look at a group and say, aha, I see that you all speak the same language, or aha, I see that you all sort of have a common religious tradition. That source of sort of common cultural or linguistic element has to be a source of the sense of community. People have to feel that that's the reason why they are part of a collective community. And there can be lots of different ethnic groups out there organized around all sorts of different kinds of identity. When political scientists become interested in them is when ethnic groups oftentimes cross into national groups. Because when we're talking about a nation, we're talking about essentially an ethnic group, right? There's some sort of common cultural or linguistic or uniting factor that makes people say, I'm part of a community. So we're essentially talking about ethnic groups, although there can be civic nationalism, where it's not necessarily religion, but instead it's like a commitment to a shared set of values. So in the United States, nationalism is rooted in this commitment to the Constitution. But that's sort of the common piece that unifies and says, we are part of a community. And that gets paired with another necessary condition, and that is the desire of group members to have political control over their destiny. That when we're talking about nationalism, we're talking about taking that step that says, not only is this my community and these are my people, but we should have political voice. We should be able to make decisions about the future of our group. Nationalism is about power, it's about politics. And so when we are talking about ethnic conflict, oftentimes what we're really talking about are groups that have these common identities that are now saying, these common identities need to be part of the political process in some way, whether we want our own state or whether we want greater representation or we want to change the balance of ethnic power within the state. Nationalism, ethnic conflict is about power. These are national conflicts. I should say a little bit about where nations come from, or where this idea of nationalism came from, because it's a relatively new phenomenon. For a good chunk of human history, conquest was relatively easy. Empires would rise and fall, and new armies would roll into territory and say, you've been subjugated. And the local population would sort of shrug and say, yes, that's fine. You have overwhelming military power. I have no interest in resisting you. Where do we pay our taxes? And there wasn't sort of a sense of we ought to resist because these are outsiders. Everybody was an outsider. You have your village. The vast majority of people never really went beyond their village. Maybe you saw the neighboring village. But there was not typically an overarching sense of this is my broader community that extends beyond the people that you meet and see in your everyday life. And there are exceptions. I think we could point to the Greek city-states resisting Persian invasion as possibly an example where there was some sort of bridging common identity among the Hellenes. But by and large, Benedict Anderson, sort of a scholar of nationalism, has said that nationalism is a modern phenomenon. And he links it to the emergence of the printing press. He has a second story that I'll flag as well, but I really think the printing press is a useful place to start this conversation. And he says what happened to the printing press is that people who really had only the vaguest of sense that the people in neighboring villages and villages that were far distant were like them in any way, shape, or form, with the printing press, there would be the arrival of the local newspaper or the local pamphlet, and you would suddenly be able to read about the experiences of people 5, 10, 20 villages away that you would never see. And you would start sympathizing with the things that happened to them and learning about their lives, and that creates this imagined community. This is Benedict Anderson's phrase, not mine. It's fairly famous. It's worth kind of like sticking in the back of your sort of social science lexicon, that when we're talking about nations, we're talking about people who are willing to extend their sense of who is us beyond themselves, beyond their family, beyond their friends and the people they meet and interact with, to a huge swath of people that they will never meet, that they have only the vaguest of sense of who these people are, and oftentimes will extend it forward and backward in time, right? So that people 100 years ago who are American, I can collectively lump into this group of who are my people, who is my community. And Benedict notes that that's a really powerful phenomenon. And it ends up transforming states, because suddenly what had been they weren't even multi-ethnic, multinational empires. They were just feudal empires of nobles that held territory over people. Suddenly people said, well, why are these nobles holding territory when they speak different languages than us, when they can't empathize with our problems, when they're not part of the us that we're imagining in this community? And suddenly there becomes this like pressure to create states around that sense of us. And those states end up corresponding pretty closely to linguistic sort of borders of people who can read that same newspaper, people who can be reported on by that newspaper, who can participate in those imagined community conversations. Anderson notes a second kind of nationalism that emerges sort of in a colonial environment, where you get colonists coming to the New World, the Western Hemisphere, the United States, South and Central America, Canada, and the experience of leaving the homeland, arriving in a new place, struggling to figure out what that means to forge something that looks like a life, to interact with an indigenous population, that creates an awareness on the part of these colonists that they are different and distinct, not just from the indigenous population, but different and distinct from where they came from. And so Anderson notes a second mode of national identity creation that comes with the act of colonization. I should also jump in here and note that just because we're saying that nations and this national identity concept is new, in the sense of it's a fairly modern phenomenon rather than something ancient and deeply rooted, it doesn't mean that something that's socially constructed doesn't mean that it's not important. So oftentimes when people talk about nationalism sort of colloquially or everyday language, they're talking about something that's like kind of fixed, something that's kind of ancient. And as we'll talk about when we talk about primordialism, that's really sketchy in terms of how what social science shows us about how national identity formed. But when people abandon that, they oftentimes think, well, does that mean that this isn't important or it isn't real? And I would say, well, no, that's not the case, right? Just because something isn't fixed in time for all places, just because something can evolve and be re-socially constructed, and the lines of where we include and exclude can shift over time, it doesn't mean these things are just fluffy, right? People take identity, they take national identity very seriously. And what makes national identity important is it's the identity around which we organize politically. People have lots of identities that they don't organize around politically, right? Twins baseball fans, Mac PC users, like there are things that we can identify as and recognize, yeah, these are sort of learned things, these are constructed things, but they're also not basic to who I am as a person and where I fit in sort of the world. And so when we're talking about nationalism, and we're noting that it's new, when we're noting that it's constructed, when we're noting that sort of those lines are imagined and not real, we're not saying not important. We're just saying constructed in a way that is very important for people and how they live their lives and how things operate. Okay, so if you're on board with this idea that national identity matters, it certainly is part of sort of how conflicts have played out over time. And I'd like to give you a sense of sort of the numbers on what this looks like. I've got a couple tables here. I'll pull them up big so you can see the numbers a little more clearly. This is sort of my merging of two data sets. I think Patrick Reagan had some information on how he coded conflicts as ideological, ethnic, or religious. I borrowed his coding and applied it to Nicholas Sambanis's 145 civil wars that he identified from like 1945 to like 2006. And I kind of plugged in some of the missing pieces where Reagan and Sambanis's data didn't line up. But I'll pull this up kind of full screen and highlight that there's been a shift in the kinds of conflicts that we see in the international system from the Cold War into the post-Cold War. So during the Cold War, maybe not too surprisingly, the a near majority of conflicts were ideological. And so we've got about 47% of those conflicts were ideological. Maybe they were Marxist revolutionaries. Maybe they were, fascists trying to take control. Maybe there was some other ideology driving that. And religious conflicts were about 38%, and ethnic conflicts were fairly rare, only about 15%. In the post-Cold War world, what we've seen is ideological conflicts kind of collapsed. Without Soviet backing, we just saw much fewer of these ideological conflicts. So only about 22% of the 50 or so conflicts in the post-Cold War world that Sambanis tracks are ideological. Religious conflicts suddenly make up a majority, 52%, and ethnic conflicts, well, not a large percentage, only 26, have almost doubled from where they were, a little less than doubled, from where they were in the Cold War period. So I think that's useful to kind of get a sense of the overall terrain of conflicts and sort of how this has changed over time. A couple other ways that we sometimes look at conflicts to see if there's differences. One of those is to think about how long these conflicts last. And so if an issue is particularly intractable, the conflict might last longer. If it's something that people are less willing to continue fighting for, less willing to bear costs in fighting for, or more willing to negotiate over, maybe we would see shorter or longer conflicts depending. And so when we track just the average number of years, ethnic conflicts tend to be the longest conflicts, and religious conflicts, I think maybe counterintuitively end up being the shortest conflicts. But the differences are not massive. I mean, we're talking maybe a year difference for conflicts where some run into decades long. So I'm not necessarily convinced that there's a huge difference there in terms of how intractable these things are. And then when we look at how they end, whether they end in victory for one side or the other, or if there's a negotiated settlement, I'm not really seeing a huge difference in the distribution of how that plays out. About 65 to 62, 63% of conflicts across these different categories end in victory, about 34 to 39%, and in 37%, and in a negotiated settlement. There might be a difference here if we broke this out with the Cold War versus the post-Cold War. One of the things that we found is that in the post-Cold War period, negotiated settlements were more common. And so it's possible that if we broke this out a little bit further, we might see some differences in terms of how these different categories play out. But I think what's important to recognize is that while identity, religion, and ethnic national identity end up being really important in terms of motivations for conflict and so often are at the core of conflicts, they're not necessarily all that different from ideological conflicts or conflicts that are responding to repression or conflicts that are driven by the collapse of a state. So while there are things that are distinct, and we'll talk about that when we talk about institutions and when we talk about political culture, there is also a lot of overlap that's worth keeping in mind.